Who was crazy until they were right all along? That dude who suggested that it might be a good idea to wash your hands before performing surgery. A gentleman never washes his hands. Hemingway. Before he took his life he became extremely paranoid. The FBI was following him. His wife and people around him just thought he was mentally ill and grew deeply concerned. Hemingway went as far as getting electrotherapy at a psychiatric hospital to try and help with the perceived delusions. Turns out the FBI had been following and bugging him for years according to declassified files. In comparison, there was a sci-fi writer Philip K. Dick who was convinced the FBI was monitoring him, so he kept sending demand letters that they release his file. His daughter was interviewed years after he passed. Extras on Scanner Darkly DVD. Ike. I heard you've actually seen your father's FBI file and it is quite large. Yes, it's rather large, but the only thing in there are copies of his demand letters. For a very long time the medical community thought that stomach ulcers were caused by stress. A doctor in Australia called Barry Marshall claimed they were wrong and that they were caused by an excess of certain bacteria, and the cure was simple antibiotics. The medical community ridiculed him and nearly ended his career. He eventually decided the only way to prove he was right was to infect himself, develop the ulcers and cure himself. In curing himself he was proved right and won the Nobel Prize for his efforts. And now stomach ulcers are very easily treatable. They previously affected 1 in 10 people. What's sad about these stories is that somebody coming up with a theory like that seems to be exactly the sort of thing which should excite medical professionals, as it not only challenges their views but also proposes a more effective solution. It's easy for me to be wise in hindsight, but it isn't as if he was advising people to rub a rabbit's ears and the good vibes would make the ulcers go away. Ludwig Boltzmann. His equations and formulas explained the physical properties of matter, but as it went against the then accepted laws of physics, he was ridiculed and ignored for years while fighting for atom theory to be accepted. He took his own life just 3 years before Ernest Rutherford discovered the nucleus of an atom, proving Boltzmann's theory. The ex-husband of my ex-girlfriend. Turns out he wasn't the crazy one after all. He kept trying to tell me, and if I would have listened from the beginning I could have saved 4 years of my life. I'm so sorry, man. There are always two sides of every story, and unfortunately, sometimes we meet the liars first. Good riddance, and I hope the new space in your life is filled by someone much more deserving of your love and affection. The dingo ate my baby. Lady got made fun of constantly, most notably in Seinfeld, and I believe went to jail because nobody believed her. Turns out a dingo ate her baby. She is still made fun of. Sinead O'Connor. Younger editors might not know who she is, but she was a singer-songwriter from Ireland who was a staple in the alternative music scene during the late 80s and early to mid 90s, who had some crossover hits. Anyway, at the height of her popularity she was the musical guest on Saturday Night Live after cancelling an earlier scheduled spot in protest against the guest host, which was some dumbass stand-up comic from the 80s called Andrew Dice Clay. As Scott Thompson described him, it's as if someone took your grandmother, the one who can't speak English, and taught her to swear phonetically, gave her a special on HBO and made her a star. During her performance she sang an a cappella version of Bob Marley's War, changing the lyrics to make it about child sexual abuse instead of racism. At the end of the performance she shouted something like "Fight the real enemy" and ripped up a picture of the Pope. In the following weeks people lost their shit. On the next episode of Saturday Night Live they had at least 3 sketches that tore her apart. A few years later the Catholic sex abuse scandal broke internationally. Michael Burry. The first guy to predict the 2008 housing market crash. He was a hedge fund manager for Scion Capital at the time and basically bet his entire fund's liquidity, all the money the fund had, that there would be a crash. No one believed him except a few other people who also bet against the market. Several of his clients sued him for tying their money up in what they considered to be a foolish bet, all to have him be right in the end. He made his fund something like $1.3 billion and the value increased about 489%. The movie The Big Short is about him and the few other people who were wise enough to bet against the market at the time. I've watched the movie like 5 times in order to try to understand exactly what happened, but still don't fully get it. I recommend it to anyone who's interested. Fun fact. Michael Burry was also ahead of the curve in the recent GameStop surge. I think he had something like 1.2 million shares of GameStop months before the price shot up. Might need to fact check myself. The doctor who found COVID in China and was silenced and died in prison from COVID. J. Harlan Bretz. He was a geologist that in the 1920s came up with a theory about why the dry falls and surrounding scablands of eastern Washington state were so sharp and abrupt, instead of smooth as should be, with a general understanding of erosion, especially since the falls have no real river to speak of to create erosion. His theory was that a giant flood, created by an even more massive lake, ripped through the region millions of years ago, reshaping the landscape in a matter of days. He was laughed at and discredited in the geology community for almost 50 years, until someone discovered evidence in the 1950s of an ancient and massive lake that started just north of Montana that stretched all the way to southern Utah. The lake was believed to have been created by glacial dams, ice walls, during the last ice age. It would fill up over thousands of years and then hit a point where a glacial dam broke and the lake water would fire out the break like a water cannon, drain the lake, and reshape an entire region over several days as the water flowed toward the ocean. This happened several times, since the flood that carved the dry falls likely started from the Lake Missoula area in modern-day Montana. It was named the Great Missoula Flood. Bretz was given an award in 1979 for his contribution to geology when he was 96 years old. He joked, "All my enemies are dead, so I have no one to gloat over." Harry Markopoulou spent 10 years trying to convince everyone, investors, journalists, regulatory agencies, etc., that Bernie Madoff was a fraud. Based on forensic accounting, Madoff was one of the most respected names on Wall Street, and despite the overwhelming evidence, no one was willing to entertain the thought he might be running a Ponzi scheme. Harry's book, No One Would Listen, is a pretty great account of financial detective work and just the abject frustration of being absolutely certain you're right but no one believes you. My wife, who never liked my mom's husband, he apparently made a pass at her before we were married, and I just wrote it off as Bob being Bob because it was honestly semi-innocent and at the time he and my mom were newlyweds. But over the years we started finding out he was hitting my mother, he fondled my sister, he was constantly cheating on my mom. He got caught trying to take an upskirt picture of my friend's underage sister, and he punched my mom in the head outside in the ice, causing her to hit her head on the pavement, fracturing her skull and causing an almost fatal brain hemorrhage. She needed 2 brain surgeries and now deals with balance issues and almost complete loss of taste and smell and hearing in one ear. He has never faced any consequences for anything because, for reasons I can't quite understand, local law enforcement in their podunk town takes his side every time she calls the cops on him. One time they even took her to jail because his drunk A fell in the walk-in pantry while they were having an argument and he called the cops and said she beat him up. He's literally twice her size. In the days of landlines, my phone was tapped. I could hear a strange hollow sound and I knew someone was listening. I had had a bad accident and was home for almost a year and involved in a lawsuit. I told my attorney about it. He told me the insurance company wouldn't bother. I mentioned it to my roommate. She told me I was crazy. I began to notice a van parked on my street. It was there for several days. I thought I was under surveillance. My attorney and my roommate said I was crazy. A person came to my door asking questions about the neighborhood. They claimed to be from a real estate company. They didn't go to other houses. I thought I was being watched. My attorney and my roommate said I was crazy. Several weeks later, my roommate's boyfriend was arrested for stealing physical and intellectual property from IBM. It was the beginning of the tech era and he stole millions in hardware and software and ideas. We were being watched to see if we were involved. The phone was tapped. We were under surveillance. We were taped. I wasn't crazy after all. The fan that predicted the show's How I Met Your Mother message and was shamed, only to be completely right in the end. When the Civil War broke out, everyone on both sides thought it would be a quick victory. However, Sherman kept saying it would be a bloodbath that would drag on for years. His superiors decided he was insane and sent him out west to fight Indians, Native Americans, just to get rid of him. After it all came true and they needed some better generals, they said maybe we should bring back that Sherman guy. That one journalist Gary Webb that uncovered the truth that the CIA aided and abetted Nicaraguan Contra rebels in funneling coke into inner city communities. When I was in Boy Scout camp we had this counselor named Don. He was kind of odd. He knew everything about trees and only really talked about trees. We had just gotten back from a hike that Don was on with us and we were just sitting around talking and he suddenly goes, you know, they're gonna let girls into Boy Scouts soon. We were all like, yeah okay Don, but sure enough less than 3 years later, they did it. In the 2012 presidential debates between Mitt Romney and Barack Obama, both were asked what the greatest foreign threats to America were. Mitt Romney said Russia, and became the butt of jokes on both sides of the aisle for it. Didn't he know the Cold War was over? Anyway, there's plenty about the guy I don't like, but I think about that answer a surprising amount as politics unfurls now. I almost feel like I'd have to apologize if I ever met him for how stupid I and everyone else found that at the time. Weird Al. He's actually a very wholesome, healthy guy with tons of energy and no one can say anything negative about him. Martha Mitchell. She was the wife of Nixon's AG, John Mitchell. She was outspoken in the extreme and was one of the first to talk openly about what really happened with Watergate. Since she was also known to love her martinis, she was widely written off as a drunk, crazy woman. Behind the scenes, a White House doctor began heavily sedating her and her husband locked her away from the press. No one believed her until Nixon resigned and the story came out. To this day, most people only remember her as that loudmouth, Martha Mitchell.